Yeah.
Again. And we're absolutely thrilled to have you here. As many of you know, uh, we were able to get our funding renewed and then it was extended. So we are so far one of the few and lucky to be escaping the axe right now. And we hope that that continues. We'll see. But for now, we will continue and very happy to support all of you in any way, shape, or form around aging research at the intersection of the criminal legal or criminal justice system and older adults or serious illness. We have two great speakers today. We do these, for those of you who are new, we do these about every 2 months or as needed if people have other things that they want to present. And we welcome any of you who want to come and do a works in progress. We generally have a speaker for the first part, about 45 minutes, maybe a half-hour talk and some question and answer period. And then the second part is work in progress. Today, we're starting with Ken Covinsky, who I'm going to introduce very briefly. I've known Ken for really a long time now. I'd say at least 2 decades. He is a outstanding clinician researcher at UCSF in the Division of Geriatrics. His research seeks to understand the factors that lead to disability in older persons and to improve the quality of life of those with older age, disability, and their caregivers. He holds the Edmund G. Brown Senior Distinguished Professorship in Geriatrics. He's principal investigator of the UCSF Older Americans Independence Center, also called the Pepper Center from the NIA, National Institute on Aging. What his official bio does not say is that Ken is mentor to almost all people in departments of geriatrics around the nation who've been successful in applying for NIH level awards and also has done an enormous amount of work helping all of us with our writing, with scientific writing and also academic writing. And today he's going to speak with us about that topic. So I'll hand it over to Ken. And thank you so much, Ken, for making the time. And after this, we'll introduce you to Erin DiMartino, who's our second speaker. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you so much, Bree. And let me see if I can figure out how to navigate the screen share. So is this working? I probably just have to
Yep,
get in. Can you see the slides?
we can see the slides.
I have to get into slideshow, right?
Yes.
Ah, okay. It's a
So,
miracle. Okay. No, thanks for having me. So the origin of this talk really is just sort of thinking about some of the stuff that I wish I knew earlier in my career when I had to start writing. I actually was not very good at this when I started out, and I had a lot to learn. So here's some stuff I kind of wish I knew, and I would say kind of like some of the things that I bring to this is my history being mentored as a writer, later on being mentoring others as a writing. And my main qualification is I still get my papers rejected from academic journals very frequently. So I still miss the mark a lot. So here are a few thoughts. And this is going to be just a series of tips. So first point is start the process of learning how to be a good writer earlier so that I was like, in my days, like pre-meds tended to major in the sciences. If I had to do it over again, I would have majored in English instead of biochemistry. And like both of my undergrad years, but then as I kind of trained as a researcher, the technical stuff I learned in my fellowship was important. Yet my ability to clearly convey ideas would be the principal drivers of my success and failures. And I kind of felt after I went through all this training and all this school, I kind of felt I had to start over learning how to be a writer. And let's see, I'm trying to figure out how, oh, here we go. Okay. So a first tip on the one hand seems so obvious, but it actually takes active engagement with yourself to really think about this because it's part of becoming a good writer is the mindset, and this involves getting out of your shoes. really fully articulating that you're not writing for yourself and really actively thinking as you write, not really thinking just about what you want to say, but thinking about what you want to be heard and how you will be heard. So always think about who you're writing to. So have any of you had this experience? And you can just raise your hands or sort of give a thumbs up signal on Zoom. Like, so you submit a paper and you get the reviewer comments back and they tell you need to discuss X, Y, or Z, and you're sure that you wrote about X, Y, or Z and you get really mad. Yeah, okay. Um, so sometimes your reviewers really didn't read carefully. But I still get mad, but then part of it is you'll become a better writer if you learn to decide that that's your fault when that happens. Because one of the principles of good writing is that what you mean counts for nothing, and what the reader took away counts for everything. So, this process of getting your ideas from the brain to paper is a tough process, and all that matters is what the readers take away. So, you kind of need to be in this mindset where you're going to struggle with every sentence because your readers are not going to struggle with every sentence. So, just skip it if they don't understand it. A few kinds of like early tips: avoid long sentences. So I kind of say a long sentence is not a sentence. And long paragraphs are kind of junk paragraphs because you might have a lot of good stuff in it, but it's all going to get missed. So one of the techniques that I've like learned to use is like I'll actually just look at the visual output of a page. And if a sentence is going more than a couple of lines, like I really think about whether that's too complex of an idea and break up the sentence. And if I have paragraphs that go more than a third of a page, it almost always is going to be right to break up those paragraphs. So it both makes the paper more visually appealing, but you're also forcing yourself to convert your ideas into little pieces and chunks that readers can actually digest. So some of the first way I learned how to write papers and learned how to write better was like agreeing to review. And there's sort of two types of reviews. There's the formal reviews you accept from journals, but there's also just when you review papers for your colleagues and friends. Um, Being a reviewer, it's actually a lot of work. It takes a lot of time to do it well, but it's worth it. And a few things to think about as you kind of get into you start getting asked to do reviews and you start learning how to do this is when I started out doing reviews, I tended to focus on all the technical stuff I learned. I kind of wanted to sound smart to the editors. But in some ways, the editors kind of know the technical stuff. What they're really interested in is more, did you like the paper? So get in the habit of critically thinking about the presentation of the papers you're reading. And sort of when you're reading, when you're reading journals, think about that as well. Like just think about like, is the presentation effective? Why or why not? So like when you look at was it effective? Could it be better? But then when you don't follow, try to diagnose why. So good habit when you're reviewing is uh, it's very common when you're reading a paper or reading something and you don't understand it, you're kind of embarrassed to say you don't know what the paper's about and you couldn't follow it. And you'll tend to micro dissect the paper and just pick it apart in little micro ways because you didn't get the big picture. Remember that too when you get these long reviews back of micro points, but they don't really talk about the macro point of your paper. Probably means they didn't understand what you were talking about. When I review, I've got into the habit of I no longer fake it when I don't understand it. I will come right out and say, you know, this topic seems important, but I just did not understand this paper. And then I might say a little bit why. I said, well, I thought it was about this when I read the title, and then I read the abstract and it looked like it was something else. And then I wrote the methods, and you basically gave me methods with complex statistics, but so I didn't know the statistics you were doing, but I didn't even understand what question you were trying to analyze. So, so really kind of be truthful about that. And when you start doing this on other work, you'll find that this critical analysis will slowly seep into your own work. So there are a lot of people who have helped me learn how to write along the way, and like my mentors really helped me. I would probably list one of the key people who helped me in my writing career was somebody by the name of Amy Justice, who some of you in Connecticut might know. So Amy is currently chief of general medicine at the Yale VA, I should say, the New Haven VA. Amy and I were like together at Case, and we were in the same era. And we were both struggling, and we decided we would actually both help each other with each other's paper, and we reviewed each other's paper. We both kind of found that like by helping each other write better and like explaining to each other what we thought the other's paper was about and what they were trying to say, we both learned a lot through the process. And there was this very interesting phenomenon. So that, Amy would tear my paper apart. And one of the natures of a buddy like this is the reason Amy was such a good writing buddy was Amy had a heart of gold and she was brutally honest. She said what she thought. So like I would tell Amy like, "Oh, here's a paper I want to get out the door. Just tell me what I need to fix up." And she'd come back to me the next day and say, "Ken, like I'm sorry, this ain't going out the door." So, but what would happen is like Amy would give me some critique on my paper, and then I'd read her paper, and I'd just like be bewildered. It's like, how could you have seen this in my paper and then do the exact same thing yourself? So one of the principles here is just because you can't write well doesn't mean you can't teach someone else how to write. And the reason is you're not really teaching them how to write, you're teaching them what you took away from their paper and what you understood. And that actually helps them learn how to write better and helps you learn how to write better. So that gets to the next point, which is that you cannot spot flaws in your own writing, and I still can't spot flaws in my writing. So the point at which you don't, there will never be a point in your career as an academic or a writer where you do not need the help of others to make your writing better. So what happens is, so even when you think you've become a good writer, and if you think you're a good writer, you're probably delusional because being a good writer is kind of aspirational. And the reason for that actually is when you think about it, great writing, there's no absolute standard. Great writing is dictated by whoever is reading your work at the moment. So great writing is work in which the person reading your work really understands what you're trying to say, is moved by it. You change their opinion, you get them to think differently about it. Since everybody is different, what's great writing for one reader is not going to be great writing for another reader. So this makes great writing something that's you can aspire to and you can try to come closer to. It's never quite achieved. So maybe you think that's bad news, but the good news is that it means you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better. So here's another tip I learned along the way. And, so here's kind of an experience. So Bree remembers Seth Landefeld, our mutual division chief and mentor. So Seth was my first mentor as a faculty member. And I remember the first paper I was writing with him. These were in the days where you actually gave somebody a draft and they red penned it. And it was before it was just a little bit before like the PowerPoint age and the Word age. So like Seth had this, I was like sitting next to Seth. Seth was trying to help me with my paper. And, he was basically like he had his hand in his head like this, kind of staring at the text of the words in my paper. And I was kind of like, it looked like he was like in the process of a migraine. And I was feeling very bad. This is not good. I gave my boss a migraine. So he would just say, like, Ken, like, what are you trying to say here? I mean, and it was one of those, it was actually like one of those like 6-line sentences. And like I looked at it and then I just like blurted a few things out trying to explain what I meant. And he just like glared at me and said like, "Well, okay, why didn't you just say that?" So You know, that ended up being a pretty powerful lesson for me because one of the points about this is there's something different about how you speak and how you write. And sometimes when we speak to other people and try to explain to other people, we often tend to be much more natural, less technical, more clear. So one of the things I've learned over time is that when I'm having a mental block or a writer's block writing, I'll sometimes put the colloquial pen down. Now I guess it's the keyboard, and I'll just sort of stop and I'll try to say out loud what I'm trying to say. And pretty often when I say it out loud, it comes out better. Another technique sometimes people do is actually the final draft of a major paper or grant, they'll actually read it out loud. And that when you read a paper out loud and you read your words out loud, you often catch that you're not explaining things well or you're not really quite saying what you meant. So it's good to think before you speak. And that's another thing I had to learn over time. But speaking while you're thinking makes you a better thinker and thus a better writer. So this is another point that I kind of learned over time that was sort of shocking to me is that I just sort of assumed that when I sent a paper out to a journal, like the people who I sent the paper to and who are going to read the paper clearly were going to know much, much more about the topic than I did. It turns out that your reviewers are not experts. And I mentioned this is very true when you submit grant papers. It's even more true when you submit grants because there's often a smaller pool of reviewers for grants. So it'll often be true of your reviewers. You'll usually have, like on average, 3 reviewers of a paper, and you'll be lucky if one is kind of a content area in your topic. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that it's the reviewers are consultants, the editors are the deciders, and that's almost always true of journal editors. So, what does this mean? So, like for me, I had to learn over time that if I wanted to submit to a general medical journal, it was very likely that none of the deciders, the editors sitting around the table, were geriatricians. And things that I knew from my training and my clinical work and research experience, they would not know. So like for me, I might actually have to define what an activity of daily living is. Now, this is even more true for most of you, so that I would venture to guess that if you don't submit to a journal that's involved in prison health, the average number of experts in prison and correctional health that will be editors deciding about your paper will be, I don't know, Bree, what do you say? It's 0 ± 0. So you really have to think about how you're going to explain the importance of what you're doing to them. So like I actually remember when I first started working with Bree, I actually didn't, I'm embarrassed to say, Bree taught me the difference between a jail and a prison. So, there are lots of concepts that people like will be so obvious to you that will not be obvious to your editors. So really think about what they need to learn. Good writing has to do some teaching, and you have to really think about who you're communicating with. So your audience is generally, I would say, hopefully smart people, and they usually are. They tend to have a good general sense of an area. So, like, you might not get an expert in prison or correctional health, but you might have an expert in issues of justice, issues of health equity. So, somebody who will be sympathetic to your work if you can explain to them how it fits into the bigger picture. Here's another kind of important sense of what is truth to somebody reading your work, your work. So, and what does it mean to have a general sense of an area? A general sense is what is true and what I think is true. So you have to be aware of biases people have and things that people might not know. So often when you get the comment back that this is not novel, everybody knows this, like it's not true because you're an expert in the field. You would not have poured your time into something that everybody knows, but you fail to anticipate what people think they know. So maybe yeah, this is the common belief, but there's actually never been data to support it. Or maybe it's based in populations that are not generalizable, or it's populations that did not include disparate groups. So you really need to think about what do people believe is going to be true, and what beliefs are you going to have to counter. The other mistake we'll talk a little bit more is writing at too technical of a level. So one of the things that often happens when you start your careers is that you've just been through training, you've learned a lot, you want to show what you learned, but you're also self-conscious that you are just learning. You want to sort of show that you really appreciate the depth and nuance of the field. And yes, that's important to do. On the other hand, most papers that fail or that get rejected, they don't get rejected because they weren't technical enough. They actually get rejected because they weren't general enough. So that most writing fails to capture the broad general policy importance or the importance to science, medicine, and policy. So be really careful about the lingo of your field. Every field has kind of terminology that's known among people in your area, but won't be known to people outside your area. So really, think about within your discipline, like what are those terms? The other thing, think about how you read papers. So when you read journals or read papers, do you like actually read the paper all in one sitting, start to finish, or do you tend to read it, then you get interrupted for like something another professional or like your life intervenes, and then you put it down, and maybe you'll pick it up the next day. Sometimes you'll even pick it up the next month. So remember that just because you defined a term on page one does not mean that the reader's going to remember it on page three. So be really careful of those things that you introduce at first and then get back to later. So the other related point, be very careful of abbreviations. It's almost, if you're not sure whether to do an abbreviation or not, generally don't. You sometimes you're against the word limit, you want to shorten things, just avoid that temptation to make up a new abbreviation to shorten the word limit. It's not worth it. You'll just lose everybody. This might seem obvious, but um, there's a tendency to use overly complex language. It's always better if you can say something at a sixth grade reading level rather than a 12th grade level. It's better to say it at the sixth grade level. And what's actually interesting is people who even are educated at their reading level is at the 18th grade, they actually prefer things written at the sixth grade level. So complex language does not make readers think you're smart. So what happens when readers don't understand what you're saying is they kind of feel you might make them feel dumb, and then they don't like you if they feel dumb. And also when they don't understand what you're talking about, they kind of assume it's because you didn't know what you're talking about. So here's another thing I wish I learned really earlier, so that some of you might have had like mentors that make you draft and draft and draft and draft. My mentors early in my training were notorious for that, and I'm glad they were. But what often happened was like I'd go through draft 15, 16, 17 on the paper, and then my mentor finally said, Ken, this is good. It's time to send it out. And I'd be so sick of it. It's like, get this thing off my plate. So then at that point, I would slam together an abstract, I would throw on a title, and I would send it out. But the problem is you only have one chance to make a first impression. So I'll ask you to kind of stop and think actually about the processes for how you decide what you're going to read. So many of you get stacks of journals, and they have maybe 20, 30 papers in the journal. That varies a lot by journal. So do you actually read every article in the journals you see? And I'll guess the answer is no. And if not, how do you decide what you're going to read? Of the many things you could read, what do you decide to read? I will venture to guess you have maybe a two-step process. You look at the titles, and if the title's interesting, you might go to the abstract. And then if the abstract looks like it's going to be fun, you'll invest your precious time in reading the article. But if you fail at the title level or the abstract title, you're done. You're not going to go on. And maybe by the time you're done, maybe 5% of the articles in the journals you're actually going to read. Well, it's kind of similar for editors. Editors basically get lots of things to read. They're actually not just asking, is the paper technically good? They're asking, is the paper going to be interesting for the journal? And if you didn't write a title that's interesting, or even worse, a title that's a run-on sentence, or you look at the title and you don't know what the paper's about, you might be done with the editor before within 10 seconds. And then if you read the abstract, if they don't understand the abstract, they will not read the paper to figure it out. They have to understand at the level of the abstract. So is the paper interesting and important is actually more part of the accept reject decision than the method's quality. And that initial assessment is made immediately, and you have to make that clear at the title and abstract phase. All right. I'm going to go to, let's call this section the rated R section, because this makes people a little bit nervous, because we're going to talk a little bit about authorship order. So few caveats here is that I'm saying this to those of you who career aspiration is to be a primary independent researcher, your own funded grants in scientific investigation. There are many very worthwhile ways to contribute to science and to be part of teams that don't have that role. And much of this, would be modified in that case because the metrics are different. But if you're sort of thinking, I want to go the K award and R award route, then this becomes really important, and it's important to think about early in your career. And the key point here is that early in your career, if you're going that route, you need first author publications, and you need to think early as you think about the portfolio of your work. Where are your first author publications, and where are they coming from? So really critically analyze the pipeline of your work, because it's largely the case that your productivity will be judged by your publications early in your career. I think it would be better if we gave promissory notes for good work underway, but that's not the way it happens. You really don't get credit for your scientific work till it's published. So what does this mean, again, for authorship? And again, I'll say this is for those of you who are kind of going that K and R route. So that how much credit does the first author get for the publication? They get 100% credit for the publication, full credit. Senior author, 100% as well. And I want you to note, not 50-50, 100-100, unless you spoil that for each other. So, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Second author, gets considerable credit, but much less than a first or senior author. And then others on the byline get a lot less credit than those other positions. So, it doesn't mean you shouldn't collaborate. You, of course, should, but it does mean you have to be very careful about what are those first author publications. I'll note that what I said about first senior author applies mostly in the biomedical sciences. In some social science academic constructs, you might want to, what I'm saying about second and senior author might be reversed. In some social science settings, the person that I'm calling senior author often will be in the second position. But the implication here is that time spent that does not lead to first author publications early in your career will generally not benefit your career. So let's talk about the senior author and mentor. I was lucky because I unintentionally landed people who were my senior authors who were terrific mentors. And when I see people who have difficulty, they were unintentional like me, but they didn't have my good luck of having really good senior authors. As you're thinking about who you're going to collaborate with, the person who's going to senior author your papers tends to be one of the most important people in defining your academic success. And you're going to ask them to take a lot of time. And if you're going to be successful with them, they have to give you a lot of their time. But also don't feel guilty about asking for their time because they're not acting totally out of beneficence. They get as much credit as you, but also remember that you both get full credit for the work, and that's a good thing. 100-100, not 50-50. So this is a symbiotic relationship. You actually should expect a lot out of them. And if you're not getting out a lot out of them, this kind of becomes a little bit politically difficult, but you kind of should get advice about how to fire them. Their most important role is red ink. And by red ink, and this is again, I use the word red ink because in my early days, we actually did have red ink. Mentors actually sketched their comments on your paper in red ink. Remember that middle authors, they can be helpful, but they're mostly acting out of beneficence. It's really the teamwork between the junior investigator and the senior author that's critical to good work. And as you're looking for your mentors and senior collaborators, look for those who are committed to doing this well. If you're thinking about working with somebody, PubMed them and see like, are their mentors first authors on high impact good publications? Warning sign is if their mentees are always middle authors on those publications, be careful. Might not be the right person for you. Okay, so next point, you submitted your paper and you get a revise and resubmit. Those letters always sometimes make you feel bad because they always kind of say, we're not sure we want your paper, but we'll consider seeing it again. It turns out that when you get a revise and resubmit, the editors have already put a lot of investment in the paper. If you get to that phase, your chances of acceptance, if you please the editors, is very high. Some journals, it's like 80, 90%. Others, it's more like 50. But you really have a foot in the door. So now your job is to kick that door down and fully get in. So this is kind of what you're trying to do. You want the editors to say, the authors were very thoughtful and responsive, and the paper is much better. And everything you write about what you do, you're going to write a letter explaining what you do. It's not a lot of verbiage and theoretical stuff arguing with them. Every comment is aimed at saying, we were responsive, you asked for X, we're giving you X. And you want them to be able to say, the paper is much better. That's what you're trying to convince them of. So err on the side of doing what the reviewers ask you. Try not to argue with them. If they're asking you to do something that's wrong, you have to kind of politely explain. But if it's 60-40, if you would prefer not to do what they told you to do, but it's not terrible, just do it. Don't argue. And this is especially true of what the editors tell you to do. You should almost always do what's in that editor part. You should almost always do what they want you to do. Also, remember that sometimes when you're being told to do something you don't want to do, you don't tell them that you're wrong. It's your fault. So the way you go about doing it is you sort of say, like, oh, we understand why you said this. You said this because we failed to explain our rationale. So you told us to use this measure. We're using another measure. Maybe you're not going to do the study over again with a new measure. You don't say they're wrong about the measure. You come back and say, in the last version of the paper, we neglected to explain the rationale for why we chose measure X over measure Y. And even though measure Y is great, this is why measure X was better for this project. So key points of a response letter: state the reviewer critique, respond, state specifically what you have changed in the paper and where it could be found. Most responses to editors are both too long and too short. They go on for too many words, yet the words don't contain these three critical components. So really a succinct part where you fully answer these three pieces. So we're coming to the home stretch. So last point, I mentioned that getting feedback on your writing is important. So I'm going to throw out this concept of the differential diagnosis of feedback because one of the things I saw in my own work early on, and then what I sometimes saw in my mentees is that on the one hand, the feedback's really important, but I've also seen people who get feedback on the idea, and feedback tends to put you in the wrong direction or causes people to abandon really great ideas. So remember when you ask somebody for feedback on an idea or on a draft of a paper. It's what you're getting back is really a component of two things. It's the quality of your idea and how well you expressed your idea. Now, what's going to happen though is that it'll always be couched often from the person giving you the idea, their feedback. It'll be couched in terms of the quality of your idea. That they'll tell you, I don't think this is very important. It didn't really strike me as interesting. But remember, that's the impression you gave them. It's very unlikely that if you've really poured your heart and soul into something and you think something's important, it's very unlikely that it's not important. Now, what is very likely is that you fail to convince somebody of the importance or you fail to express it in a clear way. So really remember to separate those two parts of the feedback and don't just sort of say like, oh, they didn't like my idea. It may be like, why didn't they think this is important? I completely failed to explain to them why it's important. So when you get your feedback, be dispassionate and analytical and ask yourself, why did you get that feedback? Do you really need to throw out the idea? Do you need to change the way you present the idea? I have to say, for those of you who are more in the mentoring phases of your career, this is something I also had to learn how to do. As I found, like, as I think I became a better mentor as I learned, like one of my mentees presents at a works in progress and they get a lot of ideas. And as I learned to sort of like not just say this is what people said and ask, well, why do you think they said that? You know, do you agree with that? No. Okay, but why do you think they said that? Things started to get a lot better. So here's an example. This actually again is the first paper I wrote with my primary career mentor Seth Landefeld. So we were doing a study. I was looking at a database Seth had of hospitalized older people, and my research question focused on whether patients who were hospitalized with depression were more likely to become disabled and lose independence after they were discharged from the hospital. And the answer to that was yes. If you go into the hospital and you have a positive depression screener, you are 2 to 3 fold more likely to be disabled in your activities of daily living after discharge. So I was pretty excited and I presented this to a works in progress group. This was actually at Case Western, not this. This is the precursor Brie of the works in progress group you saw at UCSF. I was pretty devastated by the feedback. Everyone thought this was boring. So, like, of course, people who are depressed do worse. We know that already. And they also sort of said, well, yeah, but your measure of disability is self-report. People are saying they can't do their ADLs, and people who are depressed think everything is bad. So, this is my time where I kind of glared at Seth, like when we met to discuss the paper. It's like, why did you make me waste my time on this? It's like I poured so much effort in. My K award's going to be due soon. I'm not going to have any papers to show for it. Like everything's a disaster. And like Seth looked at me and said, "No, that conference was great. You got such good advice." And it's like I said, the only advice I got was to throw away the paper. So, well, it turned out when like Seth got me to answer why was I getting the advice I got, it's because of the way I wrote the paper. So, there were things that I assumed everyone understood is that, like, yes, there wasn't a large existing literature that showed depression led to bad health outcomes. not a single one of those papers were in the hospital setting. And then I didn't I didn't say the so what? Why does it matter that it's in the hospital setting? Well, in this case, it mattered because hospitalization often catalyzes disability in older people. And, people might just think, well, of course you're depressed because you're hospitalized. But showing that, well, actually, it matters that you're depressed. And in a setting where where disability often becomes permanent, we're really catalyzing disability. That was actually pretty novel. I explained none of that. It also turned out that this kind of thing that people who are depressed always say things are terrible about their health, that's actually not true. There's a pretty extensive literature that showed people who are depressed can report on their health status quite well. And there were also a lot of methods things that we were able to do to get around that. So, but it should have been obvious to me that people were going to say that. And I just didn't think about that I was going to have to pre-address that. So paper ended up getting published in a good journal, and Seth was right, and I was wrong again, and I'm glad. So with that, I will end. I hope at least some of the things I learned are useful to you. And Bree, I'm happy to take questions or happy to listen to our next speaker.
Maybe do you want to thank you, first of all, so much, Ken. It's always such a pleasure to hear you. And as a mentor, I just have to say that every time I hear one of your presentations, it's useful to me no matter what part of my career I'm in. So hopefully everybody else had as good an experience as I did the last 45 minutes. Fantastic presentation. Maybe we have a couple minutes for questions, and then otherwise we'll move to Erin, and then we can have questions at the end from everybody for both speakers.
Victoria has a question. Victoria.
Sorry, I was trying to do the clapping emojis just to say
Oh,
I
sorry.
appreciated. No, that's okay. Appreciated the presentation. Thank you.
Well, I have a question then. Ken, thank you so much. This was
Lisa.
really helpful, and I totally agree with Bree. And in fact, I just was thinking about an alternate title for a paper I'm writing right now, given your feedback. And it's so true that no matter how much you write, you always can get better. I am wondering about the use of Chat GPT or one of those types of things. And I don't know, maybe some people are more familiar with it. I'm not so much, but I just didn't know if you had any advice or thoughts about if that could enhance writing, or if that, should be something that people should stay away from, or I don't know, it might just be an opinion, but.
Oh, that is a great question, Lisa, and it's one of much debate. I mean, it's interesting because I work as an associate editor at JAMA Internal Medicine, and the JAMA network first, they came out and said, you can't use, they don't want you to use ChatGPT on your papers, and then they realized they had lost that battle already, so we couldn't say that. I think the way I see ChatGPT used best is it's almost like the same question of thinking critically about the advice that ChatGPT is giving you, so that when you use it as a primary source, you can get in trouble. And it turns out, on the one hand, people say ChatGPT often answers questions right. They tend to answer it though in boring ways, and sometimes ways that sort of throw in it's 90% true, but the 10% that's not true can get you into real trouble.
Really bad, yeah.
Yeah. When you basically have critically thought about your idea, and then you go to ChatGPT and say, edit this for me, or make it reduce it by 20%. And then you put the two versions together, and you will sometimes see, and I've sometimes seen this with my own work, I'll sort of see that, ChatGPT put two of my sentences together and they took out some words, and I'll marvel, wow, ChatGPT was right. They said what I said in half the words, and it said everything. Nothing is lost. And then you use it. Sometimes ChatGPT didn't know why you were saying what you were saying. And
Mhm.
sometimes they edit out your key ideas. So I think it can work if you use it critically. I think if you don't use it critically, it doesn't work. I mean, I think people who use it critically actually do pretty well with it now.
Mhm, mhm.
I don't know, is that your sense?
Great. I don't totally have a sense yet of how much people
Yeah.
are using it. I agree that I've thrown in sentences and sometimes it's been exactly what I was looking for, make this sentence sound more provocative or something. And it just said it more succinctly and said it in a better way. But I guess, yeah, I'm still learning, that's for sure. So. Let's see, we have a couple other questions. Erin DiMartino has a question.
So thank you. That was really a fabulous presentation. I took a lot of notes. One of the things that I wrote down was about that slide where you talked about what is true and what you think is true, or what your reviewers think is true. And I'm curious what you think the role, obviously an introduction and discussion section is one place to address those concerns, but what do you perceive to be the role of like a cover letter when you're submitting a manuscript and addressing some of that up front in a more informal way?
So Erin, this is a great question. And I would tell you that I hear I will tell you my point of view on cover letters, which is not shared by all editors, but I know it's shared by a lot of editors. So I actually do not like long cover letters that go on and on trying to explain why it's important. And you might guess why I'm about to say that. Is that I don't like a cover letter that says like, well, now that you've read my abstract, let me tell you what I really meant to say. So that I want to see, I'm only interested in whether your paper conveys its importance. I'm not interested in whether your cover letter conveys its importance. So I would say if you do that in your cover letter, the entire purpose of that is now go back, now that that's almost like actually speaking it out loud and saying it in front of the mirror. It's like, okay, now that you wrote the cover letter, you try to say out loud why your paper's important. And now that you said that, go back to your paper and say in your paper why it's important. So no, I'm not a fan of the long cover letter explaining why the paper's important. Honestly, when I was doing this more on a day-to-day basis as a journal associate editor, the only thing I wanted to see in the cover letter was the regulatory stuff. Do you have any conflicts of interest? Do you have any other similar papers that you've published before? And if you're good, and I skipped all that other stuff. It's like, tell me, if you can't tell me in the abstract, I don't want to see it in the cover letter.
Thank you.
Lynn, I believe, is it?
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Well, Ken, I so love your sharing those quite insightful notes from your own experience, and I just learned a lot as a junior researcher. So given that my background is from criminal justice, so over past 10 years, I've been focusing on the population of involved in the criminal legal system. So given now we are highly interdisciplinary in our research, and especially here, this community of researchers, we focus on the health of the population, and especially elderly, impacted by the criminal legal system. So when I'm writing manuscript, I always I was thinking, this is really about the health issues, can be mental health, can be behavioral health, and about this population. And potentially we can looking into potentially the homes for our manuscript, the outlets can be, of course, health journals. Or we can look into criminology or criminal justice journals, which there is really an ocean. We have really highly impacted ones. We have quantitative ones, we have qualitative ones. It's totally a whole nother realm. So like, I'm just wondering for our research, if it is really about health but also related to this population, what recommendations you would really think about if we have some research really kind of can be potentially a good fit for both?
Yeah, that is a terrific question, Lynn. I'll mention like your leader, Bree Williams, is like few people who've been more spectacularly effective at like addressing both sides of this. So that in some ways, the principle of thinking about your audience and thinking about what do they likely believe and how do you want to influence them, it's really that in some ways the principle is the same whether you're going to a lay audience. So like so a lot of times, like one thing that a number of my colleagues have taught me is like you've written your paper for like Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, and well, okay, let's see if we can get a piece announcing the paper in the New York Times at the same time. So we're going to tell the general public about the importance of our work, or we're gonna get it out to like organize criminal justice advocates. How the message might be a little bit different from them, and how do you like get that message to them so that and sometimes when I think about this, I think about like, well, like maybe Bree, if you haven't given this talk, you should. But it's like, how do you, how did like, okay, like how do you convince hard-nosed judges and and jail wardens and prison wardens that maybe they should change their practices, even though they don't have your social beliefs, and that it's in their interest to do so. So that, so in a lot of ways, this kind of concept of like really learning what does my audience believe? Where are they coming from? And what do I need to do to convince them of my point? That principle is similar across audiences. The way you adapt that principle might differ greatly across audiences, and what you say to those audiences might differ greatly.
Thank you so much, Ken.
I
Does
think we
make
have
me
time
think
for
of
one more
another
quick
talk that we can
question.
have done. So yeah, and then
Yeah.
Lisa.
And then, so Elias, just a quick question.
Yes, thank you so much. I will go in the same direction of the last question of Lean, because now more and more we are witnessing that the audience, for example, in my field, in the humanitarian department, focusing on the detention, on the legal department, etc., they want to hear more about these cross-cutting, I would say, files, like, for example, forensic medicine with the IHL, International Humanitarian Law. They want to hear, for example, about the medical ethics in Islamic law. They want to hear, for example, about the disaster management, etc. So all these topics are growing more and more. So what would be, for example, the strategy as well in the peer review? Because we will need like different experts to be able to inject before submitting the final document to a journal or magazine. And secondly, probably I'm interested to see, once we have this multi-author, the seniorship of the people will play a role in designing who would be the senior, who would be less senior. I can give an example, someone who has been in the legal department for more than 20 years, having like hundreds of, I would say, publications, coming with a, I would say, forensic doctor working on a new file. So when this match, how practically things would go, I would really benefit from your experience on that. And thank you.
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the last part. So is it kind of like, were you asking like, how does it work if like somebody very senior thinks they should be the senior author, but they weren't really the one to have the input?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I'll tell you what I believe to be the case. Now, and maybe I'm like naive Pollyanna here, but I do believe now in academic circles. I actually would just say the authorship position really should be dictated by merit and who contributed. So senior author is not the person necessarily who had the grant or the person with the most power. It really is the person who did the mentoring and the developing. And there's ways to have that negotiation. It's better to have that negotiation up front. I'm a little hesitant to tell you what should be the case in other settings where the culture might be different, though I'm not so convinced the ethics is different. And sometimes when you anticipate those discussions, they're easier to have. And I tend to find that those are usually negotiable. And I won't tell you that there's cases where those become difficult, but those are usually negotiable. And I would say the issue when you have choices of collaborators, collaborate. First of all, there's a lot of credit to go along, so that often when people are worried about who gets the credit, you're often reducing the total pool of credit instead of giving more credit to one person. You know, that gets to the advice, work with generous people, who want to give you credit for what you do.